But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to record the opening part of this, but then when we go over into questions and answers and you can have your say, at that point, I will stop recording so that people can say whatever they want and they're not recorded. But I know several people couldn't be here today, couldn't be online. And so I thought I'd record. God, that's going to be irritating, isn't it? I'll tell you what, let me just go back to the opening. Sorry. I should have mastered this being a teacher. As you can see, I haven't. Anyway, we've obviously all witnessed in the last couple of weeks what's going on in Ukraine. It's been extremely, in many cases, distressing. Viewing the images, reading press reports, listening to the radio, etc. But as students of politics, we obviously need to understand what's going on. What are the goals? What are the the aims of the various protagonists? How, if anything, this conflict is likely to end, and what it also means for European and global politics. So, as students of politics, we thought we would put this event on to try and explore some of the issues that we're facing. So we brought together 4 experts from the School of Politics. Oh, sorry. Online, could you just move? Could everyone make sure they're muted, please? Thank you. So we brought together 4 experts from the School of Politics, and what they're going to do is they're going to talk about maybe 5 minutes. Sorry, online. Please, can you make sure you're muted? Please, everyone, put yourself on mute. Absolutely.
You can also, while you're talking,
thank you. I can't. So, thank you. And they're going to give a talk for about 5 minutes. So, introductory remarks, and then we're going to throw it over into discussion, questions from yourselves here. Also, hopefully, from an online audience. So those of you online, if you want to ask questions, that's fine. We have a facility. You can raise a question if you want to. You can put it in the chat function. That's absolutely fine. So many members of staff, of course, you'll know, but I'll introduce them, starting with Nadine Ansorg, who's the head of the School of Politics and International Relations, an expert on all sorts of things, conflict analysis, but also in this regard, in relation to German politics. And Nadine's done a lot of work with the German government on peace, security, and also, I think, security in the Ukraine area. So obviously some expertise there. Oybek Madiyev, who's an expert on East European politics, lecturer in comparative politics, expert on East European politics and Eurasian politics, I think. Professor Richard Sakwa, who's Professor of Russian politics and has written widely on Russian politics, indeed a book on Vladimir Putin and the conflict in the Ukraine. And then finally, on the left, Professor Richard Whitman. Are you Professor of European politics, Richard? Sorry. I want to know.
No, politics and international relations, but I only get one salary.
Oh, I see. Not much I can do about that, unfortunately. Okay. But Richard's obviously an expert on foreign affairs, foreign policy, European foreign policy, and is currently holds a Leverhulme Trust fellowship looking at Britain's relationship with the EU and European countries before and after Brexit. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to have 5 minutes or so from each of our panelists, and then we're going to open it up for questions both here and online. I suppose one thing I should maybe just say, there are no rules for this event. One thing I guess I should say is I think if we could all be respectful both of what the panelists say and of whatever students want to say by way of commenting and questions. I think that's the only ground rule. Oh, I should, by the way, mention, sorry, that we also have a politics and international relations appeal. That's the website that if people want to donate, you can. Now, we're organising this with the Red Cross. We've got a couple of representatives. Do you want to say, because you said you're doing a couple of things next week, so just briefly before we get going.
Hey guys, we're with the Red Cross Society, Student Society here on campus. The next week or two, we're going to have a couple of events. We're talking about the International Committee of the Red Cross's response to Ukraine. We're going to have a event next Thursday, 6 till 7. We'll have more information about that. You can find out about our Student Society group at the Kennedy website or on Instagram. It's UKCDRC. We'll be dotted around Ukraine events, talking about what the Red Cross does. We'll stay around for questions at the end to mention the Red Cross response as well. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Okay, should we start? Richard S. Should we start as Russian politics?
Should I go over there?
Where you can stay seated, Richard, if you want to, or come up here.
Isn't it going to be?
I'm hoping it just records, so I think it should be okay.
Okay.
By all means,
Okay.
by all means, come over here. We'll swap.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I was going to say, it's not a pleasure to be here today. Not at all. Lovely to see you all, but not a pleasure by any means, because this is something that I've been warning about for many years, and I think personally been trying to avoid to get here. So, well, we are where we are. My view is that this has been 30 years in the making, that after the end of the First Cold War, we failed spectacularly to create a comfortable peace order in Europe, yet again, as we failed after the First World War, and we then stumbled into this. Plenty of warnings along the way, plenty of arguments. I've been one, well known famously, for years to say, look, that Europe really needs to get its act together. We really need to build something to encompass all the way, as Gorbachev used to say, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. But we failed to do that. So this has been 30 years in the making. But also, in my view, up until the last weeks, it was avoidable. It was preventable. So it was very predictable. It was predicted, but also avoidable. So then we have the question of comparison. What sort of, we all love in politics to have analogies, metaphors, and so on. My argument is that there's the best and perhaps the most heuristically or explanatory best version is to compare this with 1914 rather than 1939. And just as in 1914, the guns of August, as Barbara Whitman puts it in her marvelous book, may have been avoided with more diplomacy in the final weeks. Yet the preceding 20-odd years created the conditions for a major conflict. And so I think it's a 1914 element with plenty of them. When the Russo-Ukrainian war of 2008 took place, we made a comparison of what stage are we up to 1914. We actually said it. So we've been counting now for 15 years. What moment are we along on that time spectrum to the conflagration and continue. So the same applies to the war of 2022. Having said that, immediately a couple of big questions emerge, and I'll just focus on two immediately. The first one is methodological. We in politics we love to have methodology. I know you too. You guys always also love methodology. How do you study the logic and motivations of actors in all of this? And what we all did, systemic factors play in the structure of international politics, which took us to where we are today, including, of course, not just the politics of it, but also the socioeconomic, perhaps even cultural factors. One example of this today is this really bitter discussion going on with John Mearsheimer. Just Google it now. And John Mearsheimer, who is basically saying, shrugging his shoulders, he also, in 2014, I keep saying 1914, I mean 2014, warned, and he wrote the article in Foreign Affairs, which said why the Ukraine crisis is the fault of the West. That was, no messing about from his offensive structural point of view. It was the West's fault and so on. And today he's arguing that Russia is behaving like any great power would when it was at bay. It's a term he uses, it's at bay, and it's lashing out and so on and so on. Of course, this has led to huge excoriation, and it seemed that, where's the morality in that? Where's the ethics, you may say? My approach isn't quite Mearsheimer. I've spoken to him about it many times, and so I understand his arguments. I'm just going to, I don't want to go into methodology. I know you'd like me to for a lot of time, but my approach is interpretivist. In other words, and it has been for years. Basically, I'm trying neither to exonerate or to blame, but to explain the logic of action, and the long-term methodology. So an interpretivist approach looks at agents' self-understanding of politics and to what extent they are subject to continuity and change. There's lots of methodological challenges involved in that, but that's the basic idea. What they were thinking and talking, and then on the basis of that, you'd look at the speeches, you'd look at documents, you'd look at interactions, diplomatic initiatives, and so on. So that's the sort of way I look at it. But but the choice of methodology is political. That's the key point. It's not just neutral. It's actually the way you're going to look at the question effectively determines some of the answers you're going to get at the end of it. And that's, at this moment, it cannot be more important to be reflexive about how we're discussing the question. My second observation is that any interpretation, as I say, is ultimately political, even ideological. So if I'm going to talk in terms of a 30 years crisis, as I do, and obviously many of you who know E.H. Carr will immediately leap up and say, yes, the 20 years crisis. Yes, exactly. It's very much not the same things. Well, actually, in many ways, the same sort of patterns, idealism versus realism, a la Benjamin, is once again there. But as I say, so if you say the best analogy is 1914, then immediately you're excluding the 1939 version. And that means, therefore, you immediately understand that Putin is not a Hitler-like figure, because obviously in 1939, Hitler was clearly, you weren't going to be able to negotiate, and the language of appeasement then applies in Munich, which has all been in the air in the last few weeks. But I'm actually arguing that that is misleading and in fact mistaken, because it's quite clearly, I mean, I said the logic of my approach would say that simply doesn't apply. Because I would argue that up until the last moment, there was a chance for peace, despite the endless warnings and so on. And so my final part, I didn't look at the beginning, but a couple more minutes just to say that the big picture and the big explanation of this, in my view, is as follows: that for the last 30 years, we had a peace that was no peace. That's the term George Orwell used, of course, in describing the defining Cold War in his famous Tribune article in 1945. Basically, two peace systems were on offer after 1989. Both good, both effective, and ultimately, with a bit of goodwill, compatible. But there was that ultimate lack of goodwill, and why it's good reason, good practice there. So two new world orders, to use the jargon of the time, were on offer after 1989. The first one is what I call the Charter International System. This is the United Nations, the idea of sovereign internationalism, the idea of an international system in which Russia, or the Soviet Union in those days, China, the US, UK, France, were the founder members of it. And it's internalized the concert of powers. The permanent members of the Security Council is a type of little concert of Europe or concert of the world in miniature. So it incorporates the language of balance of power, famous, absolute essential term. It incorporates buffer states, spheres of interest. That's one model of that peace order. It was the one that Gorbachev wanted, Yeltsin and Putin were committed to. And it's one that Russia and China, by the way, are very much committed to that one. That's just a thumbnail sketch of it. The second peace order, also very good, was one more narrowly created and led by the US. Also at the end, after 1945. Stephen Wertheim has got a marvelous book about how the United States embedded its hegemony in international institutions, unlike after the First World War. So, and of course, the United States-led system then had two major components: the economic one, Bretton Woods system, and open trading. It assumed the role of the United Kingdom, England, after the 19th century, open markets, etc., etc. The other side of it, the US model, was NATO. It was that security system, US-led security system, very much a powerful Atlanticist vision of the world, or what later called Euro-Atlanticism, and so on. So it had all gone. these two models of post-Cold War order, the charter system and the liberal peace system or liberal hegemony, were not entirely incompatible, since both drew on the 1945 settlement. They're both, as it were, children or twins, if you like, of that system. However, these rather different interpretations of that were then incorporated in all the documents at the end of the Cold War, and in fact, even before. The Helsinki Final Act, the November 1990 Charter of Paris for New Europe, the Istanbul Declaration of 1999, Astana Declaration of 2010, all of them say two things. One, about the freedom of states to choose their own security orientation. The other principle embedded in this was that security is indivisible. So two models internalized in all those documents. So when the West appeals to these documents, why isn't Russia fulfilling it? Russia says, we are, but you're not fulfilling the other one. And that discursive violence, if you like, got more and more intense over the last few years until it finally exploded into war. Again, I mean, I could go on. Just in the last weeks, of course, the European Security Treaty ideas put forward by Russia on the 17th of December were quite explicitly a last throw of the dice. It may have been a bluff. It may have been a bluff. Maybe Russia was not really involved, really concerned about these documents. I think they were. I mean, if at least the West could have called Moscow's bluff, as it were, and say, look, okay, you're not serious about these peace treaties, you're not serious about all of this. In that case, then that really would be clear. As it is, when the historians come back to look at how we stumbled into this war yet again, then they will say, look, it was simple, it was clear. What was it all about ultimately? And I must say, my colleagues and friends in China and India simply cannot understand how Europe yet again has blundered into this. What was the ultimate thing that Ukraine couldn't join NATO? Well, wasn't planning to. It couldn't join the next 20 or 30 years anyway. All you had to do was a statement to say, okay, we're not joining for 20 or 30 years. No, but we insist we have the right of a choice. In other words, the first model of the post-Cold War peace order became radicalized to a point it became an ideology, a dogma. It became a dogma, killing diplomacy, killing negotiations, and of course, leading to demonization and enmity on both sides. The demonization was on both sides. So we got to where we are. Bottom line, and I'm looking forward to questions, is that there's only going to be one winner out of all of this, and that is China. Everything else, the United States may look as it's going to win. It's going to win in the medium term, going to lose in the long term. The EU, of course, loses in the short term and loses in the long term. Russia, I must say, I mean, it seems to me rather weird, but so many Russians are saying, look, okay, we're going to lose in the short term, but we'll win in the long term. I don't quite understand the logic of that, but nevertheless, that seems to be, but that does suggest, and it's quite a lot of people said this, that ultimately Russia is going to dig into this war, and therefore, and I know it's going to come up now, is that if it's going to dig in, how can we save lives? How can at least we achieve some modicum of humanity in all of this? Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Nadine, do you want to go next? Sorry,
Musical chairs, yeah. Yeah, so thanks for this introduction, Richard. I think there are some things we certainly can agree on. Obviously, this is like a really tragic event, a really tragic war. And you probably have all, like me as well, like doom scrolling on Twitter and I don't know, all the social media. So it is kind of like really, really tragic. At the same time, obviously, like being a student or a scholar of politics and international relations, we have to ask ourselves, as Richard already pointed out, how can we interpret these events? How can we interpret what has happened? Like how did the dynamics evolve? And what are we looking at? Are we looking at, as Richard said, are we looking at systematic factors? Are we looking at actors and all these kind of things? And obviously, I've also, as many other scholars of PolIR have with interest, followed the discussion by Mearsheimer that you already mentioned. And obviously, like, so his main argument was really that this war was provoked as well by an expansion of NATO and the EU, so provoked by the so-called West. So what I would like to do is kind of like contextualize this a little bit and kind of look into a couple of other factors that play a role here, and look at or move away from these kind of regional orders and global orders, and also look at a number of things. So one is the agency of Ukraine and other East European countries and people. The other one is Putin's imperialism, and also what the NATO and EU kind of links, how these two are linked by NATO and EU. So on the one hand, I think, like, if we look at this bigger picture, I think it is like important to really zoom in and really question, what do countries like Ukraine or Georgia, but also the Baltic states, like, what do they really want, and what are they striving for? And these states have a long-standing identity that is very distinct from Russia. And at the same time, Ukraine, as other small countries in Eastern Europe, they very often face the risk of kind of like almost being bullied into an alliance with a hegemonic power. So, for example, our former colleague, Maria Maxa, she has written quite a lot about this on the Baltic states, but obviously we also have to ask the same question with Ukraine. So what do they strive for, and what do they want, like, overall, like, is it? Can you please mute yourself? I'm getting an echo. So the second aspect is Putin's ambition as a leader. So obviously we can talk a lot about the different great powers, but what we also need to do is kind of like think about looking into kind of the actor himself. And as you say, so what we need to do then is kind of like analyze his speeches, which tell us quite a lot about his ambitions. So if you look at his most recent speech, it becomes evident that Putin believes that Ukraine is an illegitimate country that exists on land that's historically and rightfully Russian. So he says, and these are his words, Ukraine actually never had stable traditions of real statehood. And Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. So this quite shows, like, evidently that there are some like imperialist like attitudes towards Ukraine as well. And when we look at this, what we need to do is also kind of like asking this question: was it really inevitable that this happened, or was it not? And here, kind of like obviously come the argument about NATO and the EU in as well. So if we look at NATO and the EU, so these are two regional organizations whose membership is kind of sought through like application. So there was never really a forceful expansion. There was never really kind of a force that said, okay, Ukraine or like other countries should be part of like our like should become our members. And in fact, what is quite interesting is that NATO countries have long rejected Ukraine's and Georgia's membership to NATO. So, for example, Angela Merkel, who has been the previous German chancellor, she said that she's against this because she sees it as it will increase the friction with Russia. So this is something that we need to be aware of. Yeah. And if we look at this, that NATO and as well as EU knew quite well the consequences of their actions, they were quite reluctant to go down that path. But this kind of like brings me back to the point about agency and about like the tendencies of the Russian government. So as a way of safeguarding and protecting their own countries, Ukraine and other countries' priorities was to join these security alliances. So it was kind of like, in a way, the fear of exactly these kind of conflicts and the fear of this expansion that kind of brought Ukraine to like go closer to or come closer to these regional countries. I will not talk like about Germany right now because I think I'm running out of time. But obviously, I'm happy in the question and answers to also talk a little bit more about the kind of German policy and the changes there.
Thanks, Nadine.
All right, yeah, thanks everyone. So for the last 2 weeks, we've been discussing in our models on EU models for East European politics. So we've been looking at sort of how do we make sense of this crisis. We've been looking at from various different sort of perspectives, and which you mentioned about structuralist perspectives, or the role of agency that you mentioned, the role of, I mean, from comparative perspectives, the role of, for example, democratization in Eastern Europe. The role of international system. So how do we see that kind of international system? How do we actually, the way it has to be shaped? So the role of international economic order, economic system, and so on, and where does Russia actually fit within that kind of system? And how do we understand that this crisis from the perspective of those various broader international relations, international political economy, or comparative policies perspectives? But one of the things I'd like you to point out again today, just one of the, there's so many various different ways of looking at, is the idea of, or the notion of Eurasianism, or say new Eurasianism, in the context of Russian politics. New Eurasianism as a not only ideological but also practical, it shapes Russia's domestic and also foreign policy. So in the context of New Eurasianism, so my intake is basically, I think I'd like to point out to link with 2 different dimensions. One of them historical context. Is the agencies that he mentioned, sort of the agency of Russia within that international economic order. And then the second thing is the understanding those, for example, democracy, democratization, how that actually fits in that kind of a context. So in the context of the Eurasianism, it's not only kind of a geopolitical, but when we talk about geopolitical context, we think about, for example, what Putin is doing at the moment. Putin's policy seems to fit in within a kind of Duginite, Alexander Dugin's the Eurasian geopolitics perspective. So Eurasianism means like equals the post-Soviet sphere. That kind of Russia has the right to rule that post-Soviet sphere type of stuff. It has this old kind of a historical connotation if you look at from those kind of structuralist international relations perspective. The 19th century, for example, Russia, we know like Russia has always had a very weak international agency in a sense, sort of as an actor. I mean, Russia was not a part of that global capitalist development. It was always kind of like it's actually a struggle to be part of that stuff. We know in the 19th century, great powers, UK, I mean, Britain, sort of like the US, Germany, and also to an extent, sort of, for example, Japan tried to sort of integrate through the major restoration and so on to that kind of global economic order, global economic system. And that's kind of a link to, I mean, there's so many kind of historical sociologist perspectives looking at kind of the nature of the state, the importance of kind of middle layers of society. And Russia kind of from the 19th century, I mean, the 19th century was largely feudal states, but other states kind of developed a kind of a capitalist structure that had a sort of independent layers of society, independent economic, political, social structures that to some extent played a really important role in the formation of that kind of like international economic system in a sense. In that sense, for example, I mean, the only thing is the Russia could do, it could exert its influence, could exert its power. The power lies or has always lied in the sphere, in the post-Soviet sphere type of stuff. I mean, within international relations, I mean, there was a feeling always Russia has been sort of, to some extent, is not included in that kind of a broader stuff in a big international system. But on the other hand, I mean, Russia has always been, again, always sees that its power, its influence through the sphere of the international, through the kind of post-Soviet, post-socialist sphere. So manifestation, another important element is the role of the Siloviki, what we discussed in our class as well. So what do we mean by Siloviki? These are powers security, the people with the security background that play really important input in sort of shaping the politics. And also KGB background. So what does it mean being a KGB? What does it mean being a Siloviki? So, I mean, for them, it's the primary, the important element, the important factor is the guardianship. Security is really important. It's more important than any kind of like a rule of law or democratization or human rights and all those things that are not really a primary focus for them. And there's a really interesting study done by Olga Kristovoyeva, I think. She basically studied the role of that Siloviki, those people with a KGB and security background in the hierarchy, in the Russian hierarchy, particularly those elite. Basically, according to those, to her studies, like during the Yeltsin period, it was about 13% of all these elites, the people within the president's administration, the people within the ministries, and all those things. 13% were those Siloviki. But by 2008, since Putin comes to power, that number reached 70%. So you can see the kind of mentality, thinking in politics, in shaping Russian politics, is through that kind of prism of that Siloviki. Is the idea that actually need to control that. I mean, it is the great powerness equals the post-Soviet sphere type of stuff. Another dimension is democratization. Democracy actually equals the kind of a liberalism, westernization, or Europeanization. That's actually been seen as a kind of a threat, both domestically and internationally. So in our class, for example, in East European politics, we saw some really interesting comparison. The way that the level of democracy, for example, since 2000 and now it's actually completely dropped down, declines in Russia. In a sense, there is no independent media. I mean, party politics, just virtually none. Sort of. I mean, you can say it's just highly, basically, united Russia and so on to some extent. And in terms of opposition, I mean, we know, like, for example, I mean, again, Nemtsov was basically assassinated in 2015 in February on the 27th, near basically close to the Cambrian and so on and all those. So you can see the only opposition leader we see is like from the West is Navalny, who is imprisoned and so on. I mean, he doesn't have access. The only way it means he communicates with others is through social media, friends and so on. A couple of weeks ago, actually, I also watched those live debates, so-called the debates in Russian Duma, State Duma, and then sort of ratification, or sort of like sort of recognition of those separate republics, Donbass and Luhansk and type of stuff. And in those debates, and after those debates, you have this kind of like it's the for and against and type of stuff. You see that also shows the kind of big screen as well. And then if you see like those debates, and after debates, the people vote, are you for the kind of Putin sort of the policy or against and type of stuff, or the recognition, I would say, like proposals type of stuff. For it was 400, and then against it was absolutely 0. That's the kind of a see that there was a bit of a level of democracy, democratization you see in Russian politics. And then there was one that they actually made after all this debate and sort of amendment to the Putin's proposal. The only amendment was speeding up the process of implementation rather than contextual one. And then out of 400, one person voted no, against type of stuff. And then I was watching live, and then the chair of the kind of presidium, he said, "Oh, it's actually Zhirinovsky probably like," and I kind of like and I made a joke. So that's the kind of shows the level of democracy, the thinking that way. I say internally. Basically, not only internally, but also we see that externally, the support of authoritarian regimes is really important as well. For example, in 2005, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the so-called Andijan events, Andijan in Uzbekistan. It actually happened about 2 months after the tulip revolution in Kyrgyzstan. So basically, the people gathered in the city of Andijan, protesting sort of like kind of just broader sort of the issues with the social, economic, and all those things. And then they were hoping that the president would come, and then the president would hear their grievances and so on, and type of stuff. So what President Karimov does is to send troops, tanks, and then basically to stop those demonstrations. And as a result, hundreds of people, civilians, die. in that incident, sort of like, West, of course, I mean, US, the UN, sort of the US and then the EU basically condemn all those violations and impose certain sanctions. So what Karimov does is just basically seeks Putin's support. And through Putin's support, basically they expel US air bases, I mean, US companies. I mean, for example, if you go to the website of the Newman Mining website, which is one of the biggest American sort of mining companies as well, it explicitly says, and because of those events, we've been actually, so kind of like, we've been expelled from the region. So in all those things, we also see the kind of the role of the, we also see, again, similar stuff, for example, just a couple of points as well. Just a similar situation we see a couple of years ago in Belarus, for example. So with all these questions around the Lukashenko's elections and all those things as well, we see. So, and then the EU basically makes a statement not recognizing those election results. And what's Lukashenko does, again, seeks support from Putin. So, and a couple of months ago in Kazakhstan, again, there were so many demonstrations, countrywide and all those things as well. And what Tokayev does, again, is just the first time CSTO, Palestinian Security Treaty Organization, kind of Russian-led NATO type of structure, is actually sent to stop those demonstrations. As a result, 228 people die, and then almost 1,000 people basically get imprisoned, so all those things as well. So here we see that kind of like, the idea of Eurasianism equals the post-Soviet space. We need to basically control it, no matter how type of elements. And I think this what's happening is with the crisis can be really explained to the kind of like, to the kind of not only ideological but also practical elements of new Eurasianism. Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry for the time wasting. Thanks.
I'll time myself so you can hear me when I've had my 5 minutes. Thank you very much. I think, like most of us, I feel that whatever I say is going to be inadequate. I mean, that's a sort of reflection of the powerlessness of the situation we find ourselves in. But I want to say something about the European response to Ukraine. And I think what's striking, if you look at the response of governments, essentially of Western and Central Europe, is that there's almost a universal response, and the same phrasing keeps coming up over and over, which is this is a wake-up call. Obviously expressed in different ways in different countries, but that seems to be a common theme. And I think what you see if you look across those governments which are members of the EU, members of NATO, but also governments which are not members of the EU, including the UK, and also states which are not members of NATO, the response is broadly similar, has been broadly similar. That their analysis is that Ukraine, first and foremost, is now a European country. That's contested previously, it's not being contested now, and that Ukrainians have the right to determine their own political future without violence, intimidation, or external interference. So there's been a sort of consolidation of a collective view, which I think was a much less settled view previously, I would say. And I think an extension of that analysis is that the understanding as to how this should end is an end of hostilities that allows the Ukrainian people the chance to regain the ability to make their own choices and determine their own future. And there's been already some expressions of what that future might look like in terms of consideration of EU membership. But of course, holding that view, as those governments do, is not the same thing as being in a position to be able to force or impose the outcome that those governments actually want. And so where they find themselves now, and it's surprising that the language isn't used that much, is that they are to varying degrees now engaged in fighting a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. So I think the question for me will be how long will they want to sustain that effort, and what costs are they willing to bear to sustain that effort themselves. There have already been, as I think we're all well aware, plenty of political statements some measures taken financially in terms of sanctioning individuals and restricting Russia's access to the international financial system through SWIFT measures and so on. And a fairly small number of states, because it is a fairly small number of European states, have provided military assistance to Ukraine. But that appears to have its limits, as we've heard with the provision of aircraft from Poland to Ukraine. So I think it raises the question as what costs are European countries willing to bear, and how long are they willing to bear those costs, and are they going to maintain the position that they've publicly expressed so far as to what they want the outcome to be. And I think this is an interesting situation, because it's where public opinion appears to be running ahead of government opinion, particularly on the issue of providing safe havens for people and reception of people who are fleeing the conflict. And you've only got to look in this country to see how poorly the government has lagged in public sentiment and desire for public action. And I think one of the things that Europe's political leaders are probably going to struggle to do is to explain how they dial things back from the situation that they have expressed in terms of public diplomacy as to what they want. And inevitably, when you move to any kind of process of conflict management or seeking conflict resolution, then there will be compromises to be made, which will be compromises which I think are at odds with many of those public sentiments. I think also for me, if I may, to make some observations about things that perhaps we knew before, but we know even better now. I mean, one is that the UK, and it slightly sticks in the core to say this, I mean, the UK government's assessment of Russia was pretty prescient in its integrated review, that Russia is the major state-based threat to European security, and I think that's been pretty clearly demonstrated. And also that the government, the Russian government itself, appears to have little or no limits to the way that it wants to pursue its state's policies. So there's been a great deal of naivety on the part of some European governments as to what kind of entity the Russian state was, and the public policy response that was responded. And they now seem to be edging themselves toward a position or a policy of containment. And for scholars of the Cold War, containment was a long-haul policy. It was a policy that had societal, political, economic, and military dimensions. And are European governments, Western and Central European, willing to sustain that kind of effort for a period, an extended period, particularly if part or all of Ukraine is occupied. And two other things to throw into the discussion, if I may, and then I'll finish. One is how far can Europeans rely on the United States? I don't have an answer to how much they might or can, but clearly the United States is a significant actor. But also, again, as we've seen in recent days, the US calculation about what it might want and what it sees its role as managing is different perhaps from some of the calculations of European governments, not least its considerations of nuclear deterrence and whether the US might be drawn into some kind of nuclear exchange with Russia. And lastly, perhaps more controversially, I think it's told us something that we knew about European military security and European military security organizations, but some European governments kidded themselves was different from what they really knew, which is that it's demonstrated that NATO is really the only organization that's capable of addressing military security threats in Europe in the short and medium term. And the EU's aspirations to be a military security actor are a bit of an exercise in self-delusion, if I may say so. And I say that from having studied that process for 25 years. But the question then is what's the outturn consideration? Is it that you need more EU security and that is at the cost of NATO? Is it that you do EU security through NATO and you have some kind of European pillar of NATO? And how do you address the question as to what the US commitment might be in the long term not least after the next presidential election and the prospect of a Trump 2, which hasn't entirely gone away, of course. So I think European governments have had a good war so far, if I can put it that way, in terms of being able to make appeals to their own virtue and their own values, and really not to have had to make so many difficult choices so far. And the longer the conflict goes on, the more that some of the choices that they have to make, the more difficult choices are going to present themselves. And I'm not entirely convinced that they're in a position to be able to make those choices and the cost that some of those choices might be for them. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Richard, and thanks all four of you. So we've run a little bit over, but we've got 40 minutes for people to ask questions and to make comments. So I'm just going to, while you think what you might want to ask, I'm just going to pause the recording. Sorry for the technical glitch. There we go.